It's an honor today to welcome General John R. Allen, whose service to our country epitomizes the values that FPI stands for, along with Tom Donnelly, a resident fellow and co-director of the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Tom has written extensively on the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and is also the co-editor of the 2010 book, Lessons for a Long War, How America Can Win on New Battlefields. He'll be an excellent moderator for this conversation, and he'll introduce General Allen. Tom?
Thanks, Chris. Welcome to everybody. The early birds have definitely caught the worm in this case. I'm very pleased to help kick off this conference. The program looks very full and full of very interesting panels and discussions. None will be as good as this, I'm sure, however. Introducing General Allen is a tough task. I could simply read his military biography to you, but that would take a long time, take most of the time, and result in a lot of hieroglyphics, at least for us civilians. So I'm going to translate what I got from reading reading the cave wall last night while I was preparing for this. First of all, General Allen is a serious infantryman. He's not, of course, every Marine is a rifleman, but General Allen is really a rifleman. Not only has he commanded as an infantryman, but he's taught the infantry basic course and commanded the basic course. So they don't that's sort of like being the Archbishop of Canterbury in the sense that he's defending the faith, not examining the doctrine. Secondly, of course, he's best known for his senior commands, most notably at the head of ISAF in Afghanistan, and I think that's where we'll begin our conversation. But I would also like to point out that General Allen has had a number of very important sort of Washington jobs. He has, for a rifleman, he's got more than a little bit of a whiff of Washington about him, beginning at a pretty young age. I believe he was, even as a captain, a Washington Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm not going to complain about the lack of AEI initials on his resume, but there's still a chance to remedy that, I'm sure, in the future. At any rate, to summarize, if it's possible to summarize a man like General Allen in a sentence, he's fought battles, he's conducted campaigns, he's waged wars, and he's informed the making of U.S. security policy at really the highest levels. So I can't think of anybody else I'd rather have a conversation with.
Thank you, Tom.
So please join me in welcoming General Allen to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And here begins the cross-examination. All right. Painless it will be. I'd like to really try to begin with the theme of the conference, the choosing to lead theme of the conference. And if you were a man from Mars, you'd ask yourself, well, why is the United States even asking such a question? Since we established the international order that still exists after World War II, it's obviously been a challenge and a struggle for 7 decades, but it's also been one marked by really sort of success of a historic proportion. It's almost impossible to think of a major war in Europe again. The number of people lifted out of poverty and into political liberty in those 7 decades is really quite striking, numbered in the billions, no doubt. And it's all been done at what, again, by historical standards would be considered a very small cost. Why should we even be asking ourselves this question? Why is it a question for us? Why shouldn't we naturally continue to perform the role that we've performed for 75 years?
Well, I think in many respects, Tom, and it's great to be on the stage with you this morning, and it's great to be here with FPI. And I do have the initials AEI tattooed in a place where I'll show you at some point. In many respects, your question answers the question. I mean, there probably has never been a time where the strategic leadership of the United States has been more important. And you rightly and correctly state that much of what looks like an international order, whether it's a political order or a diplomatic order or a security or a financial order, either was originated by the United States or encouraged by the United States or facilitated by the United States. And in an environment today where we see, particularly in the region from roughly Pakistan in the east, all the way across what we have traditionally called the Middle East, but across the northern tier of Africa, so much instability and bordering on chaos in many respects, across all the measures of power. There has never been a time in my mind where the strategic global leadership of the United States has been more important, not just to buttress, not just to reinforce the order for which we can take justifiable credit at a time when it's really important to preserve as much stability as we can, but also to exert our leadership in those specific areas and locations where we can have an outcome that can bring about stability, and then from that stability can bring order back to a particular region. And so we shouldn't be questioning today whether there is a role for the United States to be a global leader or a strategic leader. To me, it's a non-question. And I've spent 42 years in uniform. So I've seen the crank turn several times. And in all that time, I have seldom seen the circumstances come into greater confluence across all the measures of power as we understand it that has demanded more leadership from the United States than now. And so I think your question's a really important one. We should be asking ourselves that question in Washington every single day. What role do we have uniquely for the United States and the world? Our unique contribution in so many ways to many of these crises, or our unique contribution in many ways to facilitate and further stability is our strategic leadership and our strategic reach. And that reach isn't necessarily a military reach, although it is, certainly. It's the reach diplomatically, it's the reach politically, it's the reach in the financial sector. And so today is an important time for the United States to continue its global leadership. The question will be, I think, what means do we have to facilitate that end over the long term?
So why don't we sort of get down to the next tier of granularity a little bit. And also, you concluded by talking about the means. If there is still something like consensus about the end of American leadership, there's obviously some confusion about the ways, and one of the things that I think we should talk about that you mentioned in your remarks was the military means, which are not the only means that we have, but are arguably the means that set the conditions for other things to happen. And certainly your recent experience would suggest that. But before we get that, let's talk about the Middle East. And if you don't mind giving us, and I should say that General Allen is constrained in talking about the Israel-Palestine issue because he's still got an official duty serving as the security advisor to the peace talks there. So we're going to have to leave a little hole in the donut. But it's a really large pastry when you're talking about the Middle East.
Right.
Why don't we begin with South Asia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, your most recent experience, and where we're obviously coming to a fateful date in the coming year. I'd just be interested in your assessment of the situation as you know it or as you knew it, and things that we should look for or you think are really critical
Sure.
for the coming year.
Well, we really are approaching a critical moment. 2012 and 2013 have really set the conditions, both as we planned for them to be set, but also the reality, of course, on the timeline. The 2014 is a really important year for a variety of reasons. The first, I think, and most conspicuous reason is that the presidential election in Afghanistan will occur on the 5th of April. And it will be the election which will facilitate the transition of authority and power from the Karzai government in whatever form that has taken over the many years that he has been in power, to what will come next. And we're now beginning to get clarity on who those candidates will be. Some of them we expected, some of them we didn't. I think we've got some pretty strong candidates, actually. That election is going to be very important. It's going to be very important, not just in the technical outcome. It is a democratic process that we hope will render an outcome that is credible, internationally recognizable as a credible democratic outcome. It will produce an administration with whom we hope we can work over the long term. There's no reason to believe that it wouldn't, given the slate of candidates we're beginning to see emerge. But what's really important is if this election, this is a point that's been made frequently by not just the United States, but many of the other of our international partners, is this election is not viewed as being credible, inclusive, and comprehensive, we're going to see it very difficult for many of our partners and for the United States to justify the long-term commitment that we have made to Afghanistan. So this is a really important moment. It's really profoundly different than the last presidential election in many ways, because there has been the maturation, the development of governments, governmental institutions, and the capacity of governance. Much needs to be done still. There's a long, long way to go, ultimately, in the development of democratic institutions and governance. But from where we were in '09 to where we are today, that process has progressed a great deal. So there is a greater governmental basis from which then an election can have meaning. The other really profound difference between the last election and this election is this Afghan National Security Force at 352,000 has reach that is unparalleled in Afghanistan's history. And so where before the question might have been asked who had access to polling stations and ballot boxes and all of those things, the capacity of the government to secure not just the people trying to vote, but the process of the election is far better than it's ever been before. And when you walk out of a tour in Afghanistan, by the end of the following week, you're dated. So I'm careful about what I'll say. But we worked very, very hard to assist the Ministry of Interior, which had lead in the security of the election, to go about the business of ensuring that election is solidly secured, that the ballot boxes are solidly secured, and that support to the Independent Electoral Commission is such that the counting of those ballots is secured as well. So we've got a better platform in a governmental sense for an election to have meaning. We've got a better platform in a security sense for the government and the process of the election to occur. And so I'm more confident now than I was in '09. I'm more confident as I watched this unfold lately than I was just a year ago. But that doesn't mean that this isn't going to still be difficult. If the election gets slipped, if there's a runoff, we have the potential that the next administration will be forming its government at the very moment, at the end of 2014, that the ISAF mission ends and the next mission begins, if there is a next mission, and that's the next issue. We've done the planning. There are several different options to be announced that could be deployed ultimately to be a residual force. The NATO, SACEUR and NATO would call it, the term is resolute support. It envisages a US component and an international component. The idea being that from the 1st of January 2015, for some period of time measured in years, we'll have an advisory mission in Afghanistan to continue the upward development of the ANSF and to give them the stability necessary so that the new administration has its ability to get its legs under it, so that the distortion of the wartime economy on which Afghanistan has floated for a number of years can begin to settle out. All of that relies on a secure stability and a security platform. We think an advisory mission with the ANSF after 2014 will facilitate that political, that economic maturation necessary based on activities of the ANSF. It's in doubt right now, as you know. The bilateral security agreement was the follow-on to the strategic partnership agreement, which President Obama and President Karzai signed in Kabul about 18 months ago. The issues are daunting. Any nation that engages in status of forces agreements, which is sort of what the bilateral security agreement is, goes into those negotiations anticipating some requirement to compromise on sovereignty. It's an emotional issue for any state, especially a developed state. For a state like Afghanistan, which is emerging into sovereignty, which is a conflict-ridden state seeking to become a post-conflict society, it is even more emotional. And so there are some issues that are third-rail issues for President Karzai politically, and he has elected, now that Secretary Kerry has recently been there and has advanced the game a bit, President Karzai has elected to lateral the hard decision-making on this to a loya jirga. It is a traditional Afghan approach where the elite within the Afghan society, when I say elite, that doesn't mean the top echelons, it means the representative elements within the Afghan society will come together, will break into committees. They'll consider the question that President Karzai will put to the loya jirga, which is about the conditions for approval of the bilateral security agreement. They will recommend back to him whether Afghanistan should go with it or not. Now, who knows what the outcome of this will be? My guess is that as the Afghans have seen really substantial improvement in their society over the last several years, across many of the measures of societal improvement, whether it's life expectancy or child mortality or improvement economically, none of that could have happened without the role of the United States and ISAF and the coalition in providing that support specifically, and the support of the ANSF over the long term. So my guess is that the Afghans will look at this very closely. They'll think about what their options are if they don't approve it and the United States elects not to leave a force there. The President has been very clear that without jurisdictional protections of our forces in the aftermath of the bilateral security agreement, he will not leave our forces in Afghanistan. So the Afghans need to ask themselves, and if there are Afghans in the audience, Afghans listening or going to see this video, you need to ask yourselves the question, what are your options if the United States elects not to leave forces here? Because if the United States doesn't, my very strong suspicion is that our coalition partners won't either. And the $16 billion that was pledged at least by our elements in Tokyo in the summer of 12 for development relied on a security platform that we could rely on, could depend on. My guess is we'll see a lot of that go as well. So the Afghan people need to ask themselves what they need to trade in terms of sovereignty for the long-term security of the country and a relationship with the West that really today is unprecedented in the history of a country in the situation that Afghanistan has. Let me talk just briefly about Pakistan. Pakistan is, I think, extraordinarily important to the United States. I have very strong feelings for the country and for the people. Our relationship with Pakistan has been a troubled relationship frequently. It has been difficult on a number of occasions for us to see eye to eye across the frontier between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is, of course, both a place for a policy relationship, but it is also, as the commander of ISAF, it was a place where large numbers of the insurgents, and from north to south, they varied in who they were and what they did and how I had to deal with them. It was a place of sanctuary and safe haven as well. So there was real frustration in some respects with the safe haven of Pakistan, but often that frustration was operationalized in the policy relationship with Pakistan. And we've always got to be very careful about our relationship with Pakistan in that regard. It is a country with a brittle democracy. They deserve a lot of credit in that Nawaz Sharif has recently been elected, and we've seen the first transition of a civilian government to a civilian government in its history. General Kayani has been largely successful as the Chief of the Army Staff in keeping the Army in the barracks. We've seen many times in the history of Pakistan, the Army has overthrown the civilian government. He's worked very hard to keep that from happening because the Army, frankly, while it was engaged on the line of contact with India on the one hand, based on its own strategic interests, he drew large portions of the Army off the line of contact and otherwise committed them into the federally administered tribal areas to conduct its own counterinsurgency. They've sustained more casualties than our forces have in a much shorter time fighting an insurgency, which has helped us. So I'm always very careful about the natural reflex in this town to punish Pakistan over policy differences. we should seek in many ways to create as much opportunity for stability in our relationship with Pakistan and stability within Pakistan as well. It's got a role in the peace agreement that ultimately will be led by the Afghans, and Pakistan, I'll end where I started, is an enormously complicated and complex issue for the United States, but it's also one that we must grip in very serious ways with respect to our policy approach. Going west across the region, we have Iran, of course. Iran is one of the principal supporters of terrorism and instability in the region for a variety of its own reasons, which causes it to be a challenge everywhere from its former relationship with Hamas, through Lebanese Hezbollah, through its support to Syria, its efforts in the Gulf region, to include as far down as the Houthi tribe in Yemen and its problems with the Saudis. But of course, the elephant in the room on any occasion when you talk about Iran is its nuclear program. We've had the transition from Ahmadinejad to Rouhani, and we have seen a reignition, if you will, of the willingness of Iran to talk and the P5+1 to engage. All of that's extraordinarily important right now, but as Bob Gates once said, he spent his whole career looking for the moderate Iranian. We need to determine whether we have a moderate Iranian now in the form of Rouhani, and what kind of real decision-making does he have absent the immediate approval of the supreme leader to do anything. So it's, we're getting the rhetoric. Rhetoric sounds good. It's not about the rhetoric, it's about the action that backs up the rhetoric, and so we're all going to watch that very closely, not the least of whom will be our ally Israel, who is enormously attentive to this as well. Moving west again, we have the difficulties associated with Iraq. We weren't there long enough to provide the top cover for the solution of many of the political difficulties that might have resolved itself if we had been there for a longer period of time. So consequently, as we departed, we have seen those tectonic plates begin to grind against each other again, and that has created instability, and the body count is going up, the bloodletting is going up, and the hope is that we can hold that society together against the increase in violence. But that increase is also a direct result of the al-Qaeda elements that have been commuting back and forth across the Syrian border to assist the resistance in Syria, which is the next large open sore in the region. And the strategic stakes in Syria cannot be overstated. Everywhere from the strategic relationship of the United States with Russia and the West with Russia and China, by the way, which doesn't get much play publicly in this, but we should all not miss the opportunity to ensure we understand what China is doing in the region writ large and in this more specifically. But coming down from the strategic, we have the governmental issues, the regional Arab states, and their roles in either supporting the resistance or supporting conceivably Bashar al-Assad. And then the resistance itself. It's 100,000 fighters or so, which range from those of the Free Syrian Army, which theoretically line up with us across the spectrum, to the Salafists and the jihadists and the Jabhat al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda-oriented organization to the other side. What is it going to look like when it's done? Syria, I think, will never look the same as it did 2 years ago, 3 years ago. We may see a governmental entity emerge, but we're liable to see satellite states in some form or another around the periphery. And so Syria is, for a whole variety of reasons, whether it's confessional between Shia and Sunni, it's moderate Sunni resistance elements against al-Qaeda resistance elements, whether it's the Arab states lining up one against another conceivably to support, or strategic level. Syria is emblematic of how bad the Middle East problem can be, and it's really an essential point where the United States can exert probably greater strategic leadership. And then shifting to the west even more, our very old and dear friend Jordan, of course, is beset with the humanitarian crisis that has emerged out of Syria with the large influx of Syrian refugees. It already has a large influx of Palestinian refugees from previous wars in the region. More Palestinian refugees came out of Syria. They've been displaced from there. A large Iraqi influx of refugees. So Jordan is an old friend. We're doing a great deal with that friendship and for that friend to maintain stability and to help the king to maintain the demographic balance in his country to be that stable platform in the region. And then shifting around, we have Egypt. Egypt has now gone through 2 major political spasms since 2011. It'd be difficult to overstate how important Egypt is to the United States and to the region and to the West. But Egypt has enormous social, economic, and political challenges, which ultimately prompted the departure of Morsi and the ascendancy of the military. The United States' relationship with Egypt is extraordinarily important. I know we're attempting to navigate the shallow water of where we are with that right now, but it's hard to overstate how important Egypt's relationship is to the United States and to the West. And then in the center of all of that, we have our old friend and dear friend, Israel. We have the emergence now of a potential for progress on Middle East peace, two-state outcome. The conversation is underway. The negotiations have started. We're not talking much about it, but any occasion where the Palestinians and the Israelis can sit down across the table and seriously discuss progress towards a two-state outcome is a good time. The regional platform makes it a bit more difficult right now because the regional platform is in many respects in chaos. But any progress that we can make, any progress that we can point to on behalf of the emerging sovereignty conceivably of the Palestinian people as a state, but the continued security of Israel as a friend and an ally, any progress to that end is useful, not just to the region, but ultimately to the United States at a strategic level and to the world. And we could go west across the northern tier of Africa, but I think that generally is the snapshot that creates the global challenge for U.S. leadership today.
We could go north.
Sorry to go on.
Nope. You know, I'm tempted to say we should have a conversation about every country that you mentioned, and you didn't mention Turkey. We could go, you know, towards Central Asia and the Caucasus.
Absolutely. Turkey is extraordinarily important to this process.
But you also mentioned in your tour of the Middle East the increasing role that China is playing there. One of the things that is often repeated without necessarily thinking it through is that this is a period where China has risen to be a great power and increasingly a global power. Before you became a CENTCOM Middle East expert, your first job as a general was to run the Asia Pacific desk in OSD. In fact, that's how many of us came to know you. That is certainly the other open-ended power question,
right,
geopolitical question for our time is what China's rise means to American leadership. And our conversation here at home about that is often paralyzed. On the one hand, the sort of only choices on the menu seem to be a sort of passive form of engagement, allowing the Chinese to do as they will, or the other sort of null set is sort of a reprise of Cold War containment, when obviously neither of those answers is going to meet the challenge both of China's economic rise, but also its military and geopolitical influence. How come we can't solve this puzzle? And if you've got any answers, please advance them now.
Well, happily, I'm out of government now, so
I'm sure you're free to speak your mind.
To a point, exactly, because there is no clear path on this. When I was the principal director for Asia Pacific Affairs several years ago, it was very interesting at the time as Chinese officials came through Washington, as China was really embarking, really beginning to emerge as a force is not the term I need, an entity, a political economic entity to be reckoned with at a global level. There was a tendency to want to engage Chinese visitors at a very high level in this country, to engage them in a discussion on an inherent responsibility of China to be a responsible stakeholder in the international community. And I actually found it very interesting because, as you might imagine, the word stakeholder doesn't translate neatly or easily into Chinese, regardless of the dialect. And so we spent a lot of time, unfortunately, trying to understand, trying to convey the point we sought with respect to being a stakeholder. I think China has done, given its roots, its recent past, its really breathtaking development. It has done as good a job as anyone could have expected to emerge as a responsible stakeholder within the many different world entities where it can play. The World Trade Organization, for example, in the United Nations, in the IMF, in the various Asia-Pacific forums in which it currently exists or participates. Now, it doesn't mean we agree with all that China would seek to do or accomplish or perform in any of those forums, but they've emerged, I think, pretty responsibly in all of those. Often the discussion with regard to China tends to be a binary discussion. We are either going to give China free rein in East Asia, or we must ultimately move to a point of military confrontation. And it doesn't need to be binary. I am not someone out of a school of thought that sees that we are inevitably on a course for confrontation with China or even conflict with China. I think it is inevitable that we will find ourselves with respect to China in competition from time to time. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't believe that we are inevitably on a path for conflict, and I hope we're able to conduct the kinds of diplomacy and military engagement that keeps us on a path that prevents confrontation. You know, we've had this conversation about this pivot to Asia, and I think that's an overstatement of what we're seeking to accomplish. And it also often in the conversation is framed and deployed as a military pivot to Asia, and it's actually much more than that. It's a reinvestment of our national prestige, our relationships in East Asia. It doesn't rely necessarily on military force, although we will be pivoting some of our military capacity to the region while we will sustain a presence in the Middle East, if you will, for good reasons there. But the idea of what we're doing in East Asia is to continue to strengthen our relationships with the emerging Southeast Asian states, to strengthen our relationship with our treaty allies in the region. We have 5 treaty allies in East Asia. And the rhetoric that we use, the relationships we seek to improve, the deployment of our forces to the region can sometimes be depicted or cast as our attempt to contain China. And the reality that upon examination or analysis, that's not in fact the case. Our military presence in East Asia for a generation, you said 7 decades since during the Cold War and since, facilitated China's rise. It was very good for China, the stability that existed as a result of the U.S. military and diplomatic presence in East Asia. We are very much a Pacific nation, and our interests have always been grounded very heavily in East Asia, and in particular, given the economic development of East Asia, our economy is tied irrevocably to China and the other economies in the region. So the rebalancing or the re-emphasis by the United States in East Asia is as much about our diplomatic, economic, and political re-emphasis as it would ever be about the military re-emphasis, and it's not about containment. It can be read that way. It's not about containment. And I would just say, a couple of other things. We have sought to bring China into our military relationships out there as well. We've invited them to participate in a number of our exercises, and the more we get to know each other in those bilateral or multilateral exercises, the more confident China is that this isn't about their being targeted. I think it's also important, though, that China has learned some hard lessons of late, in particular being overly muscular, perhaps, in its pushing against its territorial and territorial claims is the right word, I guess, but the claims against the South China Sea and the conflicting claims with its neighbors in that regard. And having done that, it has created a level of alarm amongst those states which has given them, I think, a regional view with respect to China that would probably not otherwise have existed. There was a recent development where the Chinese, I believe, have come to an agreement with the Vietnamese to do joint exploration in the South China Sea. that's the sort of thing. On the one hand, someone would say that's the sort of thing we want to see, some form of peaceful exploration, conceivably, of the floor of the South China Sea. Other regional states who have conflicting claims in that area might say, here the Chinese are dividing and conquering what might otherwise be a solid block of states seeking to bring China to the table for constructive, responsible talks about how you share the resources in the region. So there's, like all of the things, it's a complex issue. We have strong relations with China economically. We have a strong relationship with the Chinese people. We've got humanitarian issues that we still debate very vigorously, and we will not walk away from those. But our economies are inextricably linked in so many ways that I think we have some substantial leverage that doesn't rely on military power as a coercive element in order to keep China in line in East Asia. So I'd like to see opportunity. I'd like to see opportunity there. I don't necessarily see that we're on a track for conflict.
Before we go to the Twitter and audience questions, I do want to get in one last topic that we would be absolutely remiss if we did not draw you out on. And that's the question of our military as an institution.
Sure.
You know, anybody who commanded the basic school knows where Marines come from. We've had just a phenomenal success with the professional all-volunteer force for, again, decades now. It's gotten smaller. It's apparently going to get smaller again, and if there is one thing that really was the most debilitating problem over the past 12 years, it was that we were insufficiently large to do Iraq and Afghanistan properly at the same time. And the fantastic weapons platforms that we've become familiar with over the past generation are reaching the end of their service life with no obvious replacements immediately on step. And thanks to the miracle of sequestration, the magnificent training institutions and capacity that we once had are almost inevitably going to result in, at least for the next 18 months or so, forces that aren't as ready as they know how to be and are used to being. This has been, without saying that our policy has been overly militarized, military power is still the ultimate resort of states and kings, and it's been the central pillar of American leadership, particularly since the end of the Cold War, but certainly during the Cold War as well. How can we expect to exercise leadership without sufficient military power to back diplomacy, to undergird the conclusion of free trade pacts, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. Well,
how's that going to work out?
Well, it's what has made and what has sustained us as a superpower has been the sheer capacity that we have across many of the measures of national power. You know, enormous political capacity, enormous diplomatic capacity, the strongest economy on the planet, which in many ways has dictated the international financial system, which is incredible power. But undergirding all of that, as you correctly state, has been, in the end, the ability for us to exert coercive power. And no diplomacy, in the end, can be effective without the potential coercive arm necessary to drive diplomacy home if diplomacy fails. And so the value of the United States military has been twofold in many respects. It has underwritten the strategic leadership of the United States by virtue of our ability to project power credibly to almost any location on the planet, to avert crisis or to stem the potential for conflict, and to do it very quickly and to do it with high levels of technology and enormously capable formations built around the professional development of a wonderful officer corps and troop corps. And then, should conflict emerge, we had the capacity at a strategic level to deploy forces, sustain forces, to fight the large war, ultimately to close the theater, return those forces, and move into the steady state security environment which would follow a large conflict. So we had the ability really to do it all, to respond very quickly for a crisis, but also if we had to fight the big war, we could do it both. We could do both of those. The challenges now that we face are becoming a series of challenges of choices and priorities. And again, as I said, 40-some years in uniform, and the previous occasion that looked like this was right after the Gulf War in terms of the decisions that would need to be made about structure and operations and modernization. But this is worse. After the Gulf War, we didn't have the levels of chaos that we see in the Middle East. It was generally a very stable platform. If you recall, many of the Middle East states, kingdoms, countries had been participants in the coalition of the Gulf War, and the outcome of the Gulf War, Desert Storm, facilitated their stability at the same time we were able to solve the issue in Kuwait. Today, however, again, from the northern tier of Africa, the African Sahel, across the Middle East, across South Asia, all the way to the border of India and Pakistan. We've got some very substantial challenges with respect to stability and the requirement for crisis response forces to be able to move very quickly. I have watched the service chiefs, and I'll digress for just a second to say that the service chiefs, when I was in command in Afghanistan, even during the beginning of very austere times for the services, denied me nothing. Whatever I needed to fight that war in Afghanistan, to the very great credit of the service chiefs, some of whom are still in place today, I got everything I needed, even recognizing that it created even more pressures on the forces back in the United States. So my thanks to them, and I will always be eternally thankful to the Secretary and to the chairman, both chairmen at the time, Mike Mullen and now Marty Dempsey. I've not seen the kinds of choices that our service chiefs have had to make ever in my career. And these choices are really stark in some respects. We're going to have to choose between comprehensive modernization programs that put the kinds of technology in the hands of our troops that they need to fight and win, or the operations and sustainment and maintenance funding necessary, as you pointed out correctly, to maintain the high levels of readiness through training and selection and development and school, and the sheer size of the force, because manpower costs, personnel costs a lot of money. And so as the budget pressures increase, the services are going to have to make choices between and among modernization, readiness, and size that can permit that force at the end of 13 years of conflict in a very focused operational environment to re-embrace in many respects the core competencies that we need for the forces to have after having been fighting a counterinsurgency, to re-embrace those core competencies on behalf of the national security objectives of the United States at a time when we're shaping the force to be smaller, at a time when we're desperately trying to ensure the standards, the continuing high standards of our enlistment, that we're putting the money against the training so that we can remain a highly ready force, able to deploy at a moment's notice, but also giving the modernization to our troops necessary for them to fight and win in a high technology fight. These are tough choices, they're very tough choices, and not only do we have to make choices about the services, but you recall that, as you well know from your own expertise in this area, our services provide forces to our combatant commanders. Our combatant commanders have war plans that have been developed with an expectation, both in terms of how fast we can get there and the size of the forces that are coming. As those forces begin to mature and change, we're going to have to think about the assumptions associated with those war plans to determine just what we now can do as time goes on. So this constrained budget environment has effects not just within the services, it has really substantial effects on our ability to project force, whether it's for a crisis or for a big war. That then goes back to the issue of what's the role of military force for a superpower. Can it really be the underwriting safety net, if you will, to enforce our political intent, our strategic outcomes, our strategic objectives, and our diplomacy. I don't think we've answered that question yet, but the trending causes me significant concern.
I fear the future will answer that question for us. I believe we're tight on time, but I would like to try to get one outside question in. I'm not going to try to attempt the name because I would only butcher it. Excuse me. But it's a question that reminds me that as you were retiring, there was every prospect that your last assignment would be in Europe. And it's a question about the NATO summit that's coming up next year and whether alliance enlargement should be on the agenda. But if I could broaden that and ask you just to give us briefly your assessment of the security situation in Europe. Again, it's sort of unthinkable that there could be a major war that's, after 500 years of Europe slaughtering itself and exporting its wars around the globe, that's probably a good thing. Nonetheless, the American security blanket is being withdrawn from there too, and it's a continent that suffers from a compound fiscal, economic, and financial crisis.
Well, I think none of us would have foreseen the crisis of the Balkans in 1990. We would never have imagined that something like Srebrenica could have occurred in Europe. Fortunately, we've moved past that. Most of the states that have emerged in the Balkans in the aftermath of Yugoslavia have become very stable, and many of them have become very successful, both members of the international community, but in particular members of NATO and the European Union. So I think your question is an important one. None of us today could visualize a major conflict in Europe. So the question about NATO is, has NATO outlived its usefulness? And I think we have been here before in that conversation. NATO, I think, deserves to be considered and deserves to be measured beyond the simple security dimension of its original charter and why it existed. The aggregation, the confluence of values that has come together by the 28 states of NATO, the willingness, and I saw it at the business end. I saw the young troops from NATO countries bleeding right alongside their NATO partners. The willingness of NATO to share a security burden was a really important realization for me, that NATO is not just about a security relationship. NATO is much bigger than simply the sum of its countries. It has been a stabilizing feature, a global stabilizing feature for many, many years, not just at a security level, but at a political level, at a diplomatic level, at an economic level. The European Union would probably not exist in the form or fashion that we see it today if it hadn't been for NATO. And so while we may once again ask the question, has NATO outlived its usefulness? I would say that the benefit that NATO accrues to the West in general by virtue of giving it a coherence and a common vision and a platform for common values is extraordinarily important, particularly now where there is so much chaos in so many locations in the world. So I do see that there's a role for NATO. It is less clear that there will be out-of-area security deployments. I think it's going to be a long time before we see NATO deploy outside on an Afghan type or a Libyan type expedition. But I see the value of NATO in its coherence. I see the value of NATO as 28 states that are strong democracies, growing democracies that have common values, the sum of which is far greater than the simple capacity of its individual parts. And so in that regard, I think it still is a force for stability globally. It's a force for democratic principles and an emblem for democratic principles. And I'd love to see NATO continue. And I worry that we are going to undermine its integrity and cohesion by making simple defense adjustments, not we, the United States necessarily, but all of the states making defense adjustments that, that begin to dismantle unintentionally the coherence of NATO.
I'm going to need a little bit stronger cow hook if I'm going to get for going over time, so somebody needs to.
I'm seeing a throat slitting over here.
Okay. So, see, that's the kind of very simple hand gesture.
She's going to deal with you or me or both of us.
Yeah, no, and I think she means business too. Well, in that case, sir, thanks for sharing your time with us. It's sort of become de rigueur under these circumstances to thank people who aren't in uniform any longer for their service to the country, but it's clear that your service to the country is just changed form and it continues. So thank you very much for sharing your time with us, and look forward to renewing the conversation in the future.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks to FPI. Cheers.